Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. Best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. We do private weekly group Zoom chats with supporters where we shoot the breeze discussing world events. I bring back past podcast guests on occasion to do a live Q&A session with supporters, and I do a weekly roundup of the news headlines with my own analysis that many people are very much enjoying. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Wise, Donor Box. Other options are on the website. Preachers Consult if you want to chat with me, and do check out all of my affiliates over at the website and leave a podcast review if you haven't already. Joining us is Dominic Bowen, who's recognized as one of Europe's foremost experts in risk management and business leadership, with over 2 decades of experience in mitigating risks and managing crises across various industries and geographies. As a partner at 2Secure, which is out in Sweden, head of the Strategic Advisory Business Unit, Dominic has consistently delivered an unparalleled expertise in helping organizations navigate complex risk landscapes. His strategic insights and hands-on approach have been instrumental in safeguarding businesses' interests against emerging threats and ensuring operational resilience amongst some of Europe's most impactful companies. He's also got a podcast, International Risk Podcast. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Dominic.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for having me on today.
And so, I was listening to one of your podcast, particularly on Mexico. We'll get to that later. And I think you were spot on. So I was impressed by the level of the work that you do, when it comes to risk assessment and what you're doing at 2Secure. And so before we get your take on the world, whatever you want to tell us about the work that you're doing, 2Secure, the International Risk Podcast and whatnot.
Oh, thanks very much. I appreciate that. It's quite interesting. You and I were talking just before we started recording about podcasts, and it's just such a fantastic medium to speak to so many amazing people. With the US elections coming up, I've been speaking to quite a few academics and think tanks and experts on a whole range of topics, from far right extremism to conspiracy theories. And there's just some really, really brilliant people out there. So I think podcasting, as you all know, that finding is such a fantastic medium for that. And that's one of the reasons why, I keep doing the International Risk Podcast. I get to speak to these amazing people, and people benefit from hearing different points of view. And I don't necessarily, probably like you, don't necessarily subscribe or agree to everything and every guest we have on the podcast, but it's a fantastic discussion. It's a really great medium. I'm so thankful that we have podcasts, and it really complements the work that I do at 2Secure, just working with business leaders, board members, executives to try and make sense of what is quite a chaotic world. A lot of people are calling it a perma-crisis, but trying to navigate that world and really, thrive when many people are just having a difficult time surviving. So I'm really blessed to be able to do this sort of work.
Yeah, and just again, a note on your podcast, for example, you had some guests or topics that were not of interest to me, and same with my podcast. There are some listeners that don't enjoy a particular guest or theme or whatever. And my view is always, I'll take this, I'll discard that. And that's just how it is for podcasts. But, again, when I listen to your Mexico thing, I'm here in Mexico, I'm a Mexican national, and you were spot on, which speaks to your expertise and professionalism. But maybe to start, the global macro situation, I always like to start big and then drill on down. Geopolitics and Empire, that's the name of the podcast, and to get your thoughts on empire and world order. We've been living under Pax Americana for a long time. I think BRICS just wrapped up in Kazan, and there's this talk. For the longest time, there's been talk of a decline of the West. I've interviewed the late Johan Galtung, who's talked about the fall of the American empire and this rise of the East. BRICS, multipolarity. You see them making all these deals, SCO, Belt and Road, trade deals. Now they're de-dollarization, and so what's your sort of pulse on where we're at?
I think it's an incredibly interesting time. My postgrad studies was in international relations, geopolitics, and international law, and I loved it. One of the reasons I found university so enjoyable was just the fact that effectively I got to cruise the media. I got to study what was happening around the world, and I was working overseas a lot. I was in Burma and Iraq for much of my studies, and then coming back and forth to Australia. But being able to study what was happening in real time. But the world is just evolving at such a phenomenal pace and in such a direction you wouldn't pick. I was on another podcast about a month ago, and we were speaking about the BRICS. BRICS was the topic of the conversation, and at no point during that podcast did I talk about the head of the United Nations going to the BRICS summit in Russia. At no point did I predict that you'd have world leaders hugging Putin in front of the cameras, world leaders that, are part of the Quad. I mean, the India Prime Minister, Modi, was hugging President Putin on camera deliberately. These are the same country that is in the Quad, a partnership with America and Australia. So the world is in a really different dynamic. And, just commenting today when, the day we're recording this podcast, Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, said that the BRICS, Brazil, a country which is, probably considered one of the good guys today, but certainly there's countries that are a little bit more challenging, a bit more pariah states, countries like Russia at the moment. But Antonio Guterres said that, no single country, no single group can solve peace alone, and the BRICS and these countries have an important role to play, and they unquestionably do. He's right there. But for him to say that when one of the leading members of the BRICS, the Russia, is actively engaging in what all scholars would agree is an illegal armed conflict is really a very, very challenging and I guess maybe confusing and perhaps a dynamic environment for business leaders and academics to be navigating.
And I do want to get your thoughts on the war, but just before sticking on BRICS, the again, Pax Americana, this sort of rising new order. Again, I'm on the fence of where things will go. Sometimes I feel that the talk of the decline of the West is somewhat hyped, but you do see, in some ways, living standards somewhat declining in the West, but still the economies are strong. And so I sort of feel like lately BRICS will be sort of like a complement. So it's gonna going forward, both are sort of going to be there going forward, and it's not going to be so much one or the other. Just any thoughts on that?
It really is easy to pick the decline of America and suggest it's going to happen. But if you just look at the data, whenever I'm confused, I'll go back to the legal principle or the first principle, go back to the basic text. And if you just look at the data, you can say, yeah, the American economy is struggling and there's difficulties. If you look at the 12 leading tech companies, if you look at the 7 leading tech companies in the US of A, we're talking about $12 trillion in market cap. If you look at the 7 European leading technology companies, you're looking at about 800 million. So 12 trillion versus 800 million for the entire European Union. There simply is no comparison. And it's similar statistics when you look at the military, the Navy, when you look at the workforce, the GDP. America really is an extremely powerful country and the world leader for a reason. It's not just because of the dollar. It's not just because of the military force or the tech, but it's also the universities, the amazing Ivy League universities. I mean, they're a huge predictor of success. Not the only predictor of success, but getting a place in an Ivy League university in the US of A is unquestionably a predictor of success. So I think it certainly would be premature to say that the US is in decline, but that's not to say there's not rising powers. There definitely is. And I think your analogy about it being a more multipolar world, about countries like China, like India, countries with populations approaching 2 billion people each, history, if you only have to look back in history, we'll see that, it's perhaps a return to power, not a new thing for India and China, but perhaps a return to where they've been for much of history.
Yeah, like I said, I've a lot of these things, I don't know. I'm on the fence. I can feel they go either way, which is why I have guests from both camps on, like I mentioned, Johan Galtung, or cultural historian Morris Berman, who's written a trilogy on the collapse of American empire. And then, I've had on scholars like Michael Beckley, who says America will remain the superpower. He's refused to come back on because geopolitics and empire has gotten a bit edgy, too edgy for him, because he's a bit of a Washington now scholar, but that's all right. I still appreciate his work. What about the wars? There's a lot of talk about World War III, and you're getting leaders. I think the new head of Indonesia talking about World War III, Erdogan's talking about World War III, the Russians, the Europeans. And you've got these multiple flashpoints. I view them all as interlinked. What's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, what some say is inevitably going to happen with Taiwan. What's sort of your take? You can dig into more detail if you like, but just with the wars that are going on and the potential for escalation.
I think if we look at the macro level, if we look at the United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals. Many companies have signed up to them. All countries have signed up to them. They're just the goals that we're meant to be working towards. We've only achieved, we're only making progress on about 20% of them. So that's 80% we're not making any progress on. And you can easily go, so what? But that means that we're talking about things about literacy rates, access to healthcare, access to reasonable levels of economic freedom and political freedom and practicing religion. These things are not being achieved in much of the world. And then if we look at the conflict that you spoke about, I mean, look at the numbers. What's happening in Israel, in Lebanon, in Palestine is just absolutely shocking. Whatever your political viewpoints on, whoever you consider the terrorists and whoever you consider at fault there, I mean, over 40,000 civilians killed in Palestine, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese displaced. I think it's close to 100,000 Israelis displaced. Of course, we had over 1,000 Israelis killed and kidnapped over a year ago now. I mean, it's just absolutely tragic. It's not working. If you look at Ukraine, a very powerful country, if Ukraine was admitted into the European Union, it would be the fifth largest member within the European Union. I mean, it's a powerhouse. And you look at a country like Sudan, another powerhouse in Africa. These countries are all beset by conflict, and none of them should be. None of them should be. These are all countries that have the power, the natural resources, and the population and the demographics, really importantly, the demographics, that they should be thriving countries. And they're not. They're countries beset by war. And that's not sustainable. That's not good. It's not good for America. It's not good for any of the BRICS nations.
Do you see, I mean, as you say, they shouldn't, I mean, even Mexico, which we'll talk about in a bit, would be a powerhouse in terms of economy. But again, you've got all these issues of insecurity, and which is keeping us down. But do you feel we could be on the road to a third world war? Is that a possibility, or do you think we can get an off-ramp there?
I think the risks of a significant international armed conflict that could be labelled a World War III is something that is likely, is really worrying. When I was, how old was I? I was in primary school during Gulf War One, and you might remember that. You're a similar demographic to me. And it was the first televised war. And I remember being a young boy just watching this, and you could see the types of aeroplanes, the types of missiles, the types of tanks. And I remember cutting these out from the newspapers every day. And I remember I can still see it in my mind's eye. I was drawing pictures of tanks and trying to learn how to draw a picture of an aeroplane. And I remember just sitting there and just going, oh, and I felt sad as a young boy, 7 or 8, I think I was. And I went, there's not going to be any wars for me to fight when I become an adult. And then, sure enough, I've spent the last 20 years in most major conflict zones. And, I'm fearful, but I've resigned to the fact that, sadly, I think my son's going to no doubt be fighting in wars as well. I think that is the future. And I think, one of the biggest fears when people ask me about, what's the big problem if Russia does invade? I was in Ukraine just before Russia invaded. I was in Mariupol, Avdiivka, Odessa, many of the cities that were heavily impacted, and some of them completely destroyed by the Russian invasion. And when I came back to Europe, many people were asking me, what's the big thing? Why does this matter? And I said, obviously, there's the impact on the Ukrainians, and there's the potential impact across all of Europe. But what this also does is it signals to many other countries that the rule of law is not worth the paper it's written on. The rule of law is flexible. Might makes right. And, we've seen that in Burma. We've seen more coups in African countries in the last 3 years than we've seen in the previous 2 decades. The international system isn't as strong. We've seen a massive decline of democracy, and countries are more confident to breach international law. That's just the facts. It's just the data. That's the situation where we're at. And I think in that situation where leaders and countries and increasing amounts of nationalism, that leads to a potential for miscalculation. And I think the final point on that one, you can dig deeper and wherever you'd like, but I think the final point is when Trump was first elected presidency, people, would be discussing, people would say, we're obviously concerned about this and this and this. And I said, what concerns me most about a Trump presidency, and this was in 2016, but I said, what concerns me most when he first got elected to office was just the lack of predictability. You don't have to like your diversity. You can be an American and not like China. You can be American and not like Russia. That's okay. That's fine. That's just how the world is. But there's a level of predictability, and that level of predictability means that you can generally avert conflict, because no one wants war, but you can avert it because of a level of predictability. Trump brings a level of unpredictability, which some people think is one of his strengths, but in international relations, I would certainly argue that it's a real danger card. It's a real danger card for the whole world.
I found interesting, I was joking yesterday. So we've got North Korean troops purportedly going into Ukraine. And now South Korea says they want to send South Korean troops into Ukraine. And my joke was, is this how World War III starts, where the Koreans start shooting at each other in Ukraine? You know, it's almost like Doctor Strangelove, cartoonish. And so any thought on Taiwan? I feel that it seems China is preparing to take Taiwan. I feel that's an inevitability. Just how's your work? Do you go to Asia often?
Yeah, certainly, and it's a country that would at least be at least once a week. I'll get an executive team or a board that'll ask for a presentation and a discussion around the risks to their companies. And I think most of the companies I'm working with anyway are very seriously looking at their supply chains. And moving your supply chains is not something you can just do overnight. Some of these things takes years, and might be a surprise to people that don't work in some big businesses. But it might even take up to a decade to fully extradite yourself from a country if you've got significant investments there and supplies, etc. So these moves take time, and watching the ships sail across the Taiwan Strait, that's not the time to be moving your assets out. As many companies saw, I've got one client that lost 20 billion when Russia invaded Ukraine. 20 billion, and these things need to be done in advance. So I think there is a lot of companies that are seriously concerned about this, and you've got to be cautious about confirmation bias, that bias that you look for data that confirms your theory. Now, if you are of the theory that, there is a high likelihood that China is going to invade, there's a lot of things that you can see. Obviously China's massively and rapidly growing military. I mean, China didn't have a deep water fleet, as in it didn't have a navy that could sail far out from its borders. It really was a purely defensive 10, 15 years ago. Now it's got the second largest navy, and it's got a very impressive sized navy. Its nuclear arsenal is massively increased. It's regularly testing the defenses of the Taiwanese. And then, of course, Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he would like a one China. He would like China unified. He's 70. He would like to see it in his while he's alive. That means, at best, he's got a decade to implement that. China's demographic curve is not heading in the right direction. So again, if you want to take advantage of the size of the population and the demographics you've got, you're probably looking within the next 5 to 10 years that you'd want to be, if you want to be launching a war, demographic-wise, you'd need to be doing that in the near future. So there is quite a lot of indicators, but I am conscious of the fact that confirmation bias you'll find information that would indicate why that would occur. So I think it is a possibility. It's certainly something that I'm advising my clients to be really cautious and to be really auditing their supply chains. I'm not saying to pull out of China. I've not given the advice to any company to pull out of China, but I certainly have given the advice to consider what if. Look at the scenarios and run scenarios. And that's what we do a lot. We run scenarios with companies and go, what if this happened to the supply chains? What if this happened to one of your businesses in country? What would that do? And, you do the same thing with the American elections. If Trump wins, the tariffs will go up from 380 billion when he was last president to 2.7 trillion in a second Trump presidency. I mean, that will have huge impact on trade flows. So doing situation planning and scenario testing on all your forms of business is important. Whether or not there's war, there's certainly going to be other disruptions, almost guaranteed.
So we're going around the world. When I was a kid, I don't know if you remember this TV show. They also made it into like games and all sorts of other merchandise. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? I was a huge fan of Carmen Sandiego. Where in the world?
I haven't thought about that for about 30 years, but yes,
I just loved it as a kid. All right. So I think for me, when looking at Asia, one of the important things is the war aspect, this talk of Asian NATO, South China Sea, Taiwan issue, and the supply chains, what you're talking about. To go back to Europe, then, because you're based in Europe. I've had a number of, over the years, I'm a European myself. I'm a Croatian citizen. I've lived in Europe. And I've interviewed some European intellectuals, French, Swiss. They have said that as a consequence of Ukraine war, this is causing Europe to deindustrialize. You look at Germany, some of the green policies. And so what are your thoughts as to the state of Europe?
Europe is slow. I have to say, working for European companies, working for a couple of US companies, Europe is slow. It's bureaucratic, and I think the European Union, people criticize the Australian government, the British government, the American Congress and Senate, but oh my gosh, look at the European Union and how heavy they regulate. The European Union is a big beast, and it's a complex one. I mean, you've got countries like Hungary, Serbia, Austria, Italy, Spain, that are still buying fuel, that are still aligned with Russia to varying degrees within the same European Union that's also sending, and through NATO, sending weapons to Ukraine. I mean, it's a hugely complicated beast. I don't think Europe's in the decline, but I think, Emmanuel Macron made the comment a few weeks ago that, if Europe doesn't make changes within the next few years, it's dead. And, obviously he was being deliberately controversial and trying to spark discussion, but I think he was right to be doing that. I think there are certain challenges with Europe, and I think there's so much potential here. So much potential across the entire continent, but it's not being tapped. It's really not being tapped. And it's a shame because there's some amazing, amazing universities. There's some amazing academics and business leaders, but it's, literally, if you put your money where your mouth is, you're going to be investing in America, not Europe.
I want to get your thoughts on NATO. I'm not a fan of NATO, but that's neither here nor there. But, we look at things objectively, and just to get your thoughts on how you see NATO. It seems to be, they've been adding members. Turkey's a member, and they're keen on BRICS. So they are sort of like an interesting outlier there. What's your thoughts on the state of NATO? And, they're talking about Asian NATO. You mentioned Quad earlier. There's AUKUS. They're pushing South Korea to get nukes, and so forth. What's important for you when it comes to NATO?
We all live in tribes. When I lived in Australia, I described myself as living in inner city. But then if I was traveling around Australia, I'd describe myself as from Melbourne. When I'm overseas, I'm from Australia. We live in tribes, and that tribe gets bigger depending on where we are. And I think NATO is just an extension of that. It's just it's a tribe, and we're trying to keep people in the tribe. We're trying to keep people on our side and trying to influence them. And I understand. And you talk about Turkey. You use Turkey as an example. I think you could easily use Hungary as an example. Why are they allowed to be in in NATO when they're clearly supporting what would be generally considered the enemy right now, Russia, as far as NATO is concerned. But I think the argument is that it's better to keep these people in our tribe, in our group, in our gang, so to speak. And so I think there's value in that. But it is a very, very large collective. I remember when I was still working, and we have different in Australia, like most or all NATO member countries, you have different levels of security clearance. And when you get a TS or a top secret security clearance, there's different types. Even there's top secret Australian eyes only, which is never to leave. It's only for Australian top secrets. Then there's Australian. The next best is top secret Five Eyes, which is the Five Eyes intelligence sharing collaboration. And then when it extends to top secret NATO, that's junk status. That you can publish it in the newspaper, because once it goes to NATO, it's such a big beast. It's so open, and there's so many different members. You can almost guarantee the Taliban will have that information the next day. Which at the time I thought that can't be true. That's not true. But then you only have to dig a little bit deeper, and there's so many case studies. You only have to look at the beast that is NATO to realize that this is a huge collection of nations. This is a huge collection of people, and it's not surprising that it's not perfect. But you know what? It's probably better than having the 20 odd members operating completely independently with no alignment at all. So I think it's better than nothing, but I recognize that it has its flaws. And I'd love to hear from you, if that's okay, about what's your doubts or dislike for NATO.
I mean, as a Croatian myself, I mean, there's a further history. I'm just ideological. It's an ideological thing because I look at globalism, right? This idea of a global elite, and I view NATO as an institution, a platform for. I view it as an imperial sort of product, and it's not to say that Russia. I heard on. I think I had one of your guests on talking about Russia has imperial. What do you call it? Motivations. I'm not saying that's not true either, or other countries. But I just view sometimes there's a double standard where we say, look, Putin is trying to expand, but we're doing the same thing, and it's just like it's not okay when let's at least be honest. We had Guy Verhofstadt a few years ago say we're in a new age of empires. And there's a European academic, Wolfgang Stricht, who says the EU is an empire. It's an empire, and let's just be blunt about it. Let's not pretend we're some sort of it's a supranational union. No, it's an empire. Russia's building an empire. China, and so let's be honest. I did want to get your thoughts on your assessment of the strength of NATO because, again, we're awash in propaganda. There's Russian propaganda, there's NATO propaganda, and I've had guests from both sides trying to qualify the strength of NATO, trying to qualify the strength of Russia. I'm not certain. I've had guests who's a former diplomat say NATO. I think he called it or referred to it as a paper pussycat or something. But I'm not sure. It just you hear this talk of there's not enough defense spending for NATO. They need to increase the budget. It still does seem to be a force to be reckoned with. What's your sort of assessment?
Militaries take a long time to modernize, and Sweden. I'm in Stockholm right now, and Sweden's a great example. In the early 1930s, the Swedish government realized that war was coming to Europe, and they needed to modernize their military. And they realized that in the 1930s, and you'd say, "Well done, Sweden. That was good of you. You realized." They'd finished that modernized effort by 1955. 1955. Obviously, the war had been and gone, and Sweden had largely managed to avoid the fighting for a variety of diplomatic things, which we can unpack another day. But it takes a long time. It takes decades. You look at the AUKUS. You mentioned AUKUS before, where the Australian government will acquire the technology and the skills and capability to manage nuclear-powered submarines. That's going to take decades. You go, come on, surely we can just buy a couple of nuclear-powered submarines and be done with it. No, it takes decades. It takes decades. And I think, many NATO members, perhaps at the prompting of Donald Trump, have now increased their spending, which is, in accordance with the obligations of being a NATO member, which I think is largely positive. But, just because you're spending money doesn't mean your junior officers, let alone your generals, know how to spend it and it's being spent on the right thing. And doesn't mean you've got in Australia, we talk about the esprit de corps, but really it's that will to fight, that cohesion, that loyalty to your country, loyalty to your peers. That takes generations. That takes generations to build. So I think, again, NATO's heading in the right direction. NATO's doing what it was. But I think descriptions like a paper tiger or paper pussycat that you quoted your former guest on is certainly something that is worth exploring. And I think, you look at there's been some, just mind-boggling stats about the amount of ammunition that Russia's using. So the 155 artillery shells, which is, one of the most common weapons or artillery is being used in Ukraine. In just one region, just in Donbass alone, Russia fires every 5 days enough artillery shells that is the same equivalent of the entire NATO forces minus America. So the European-based NATO members, all of their artillery shells, including their emergency stocks and reserves, Russia is firing every 5 days in just one part of the war zone in Ukraine. And to think that Europe can step up and fight a war against Russia when that's the sort of tactics that Russia's employing. Now, admittedly, Ukraine is doing an absolutely phenomenal job at slowing Russia's advance across the country. But they're fighting for their lives. And Ukraine, it's not the first time Ukraine's fought Russia. I mean, this is something that's been going on for hundreds of years. Would Europe be as effective and cohesive in fighting against Russia? That would be a hot debate to have.
Yeah, and I mean, we look at, we also, just briefly on the history, Napoleon tried to invade Russia. He failed. Hitler, I think pretty much single-handedly, the objective view of history, not a fan of Soviets or communism at all, or fascism, but I think the Soviets did defeat the Nazis when it comes down to the wire. But what you mentioned, the West, in terms of it seems like they've been the Russians are now practicing. They're in war, and so they're developing these capabilities. You had the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, I think, some months ago. They in one deployment used up their entire annual stock of missile and munitions, and so I think that just speaks to how out of practice the West has been. Let me ask you about the economy. Just your thoughts on maybe in general where the wind is blowing when it comes to the economy. What parts of the region you think are on the up, which ones maybe are on the decline? Supply chain stuff. There's tech and AI. I've heard you talk about this dollar reserve. Again, I've had guests that are bullish, saying nothing can replace the dollar. The whole world is using dollars, and others that say dollar is gonna hyperinflate and it's going to crash. And it's just like, I don't know. I don't know anymore. And so just your pulse when it comes to economy, de-dollarization, and that.
Yeah, that's certainly a big black hole. You can easily lose yourself under so many different warrants and come out with a whole bunch of different analysis. But I think there's a couple of important points to consider. During the Cold War, a lot of analysts and a lot of political commentators and academics argued that we managed to maintain a level of peace during the Cold War because we had the balancing powers. We had the Soviet Union and we had America, and they were balancing powers. Now we don't have a Cold War. We have different types of Cold Wars going on. But what we do have is we have the balancing power of the US dollar balancing against the supply chains in China. There is no other country that has the intricate level and the weight and the power of the supply chains that travel through and originate from China. It's just unavoidable. Companies are all tied to China because of the supply chains in the same way that we're all tied to the US dollar. So that's a real balancing power at the moment. But the way those two powers are dealing with each other and is potentially going to get worse. I mean, even if we end up with a Democratic president, even if we end up with Harris in the White House, she's still going to keep tariffs. She's still going to have a level of protectionism. Now, I think we all assess that it'll be much more targeted than a Trump administration, but we're not going to go back to a policy of hugs and kisses with Camilla when it comes to America-China relations. So that's going to continue to be a very serious competition. The stock markets are on a phenomenal ride. I mean, it's been a bull market for about 2.5 years. The average bull market, if you look back over the last 3 to 4 decades, the average bull market lasts for about 5 years. So if we run with the averages, we're about halfway through a bull market, which is good because our interest rates are only just coming down now. So there's a lot of people around the world that are hurting, a lot of people that are hurting. So another couple of years of a bull market would be great. But it's really complicated. It's really complicated. If you look at the US is obviously in a monetary tightening policy. Interest rates are declining very fast. Where I think it's a 91% chance that the US Federal Reserve will drop interest rates by another 0.25% in the next couple of weeks. And so there's less bond buying. The market's doing really well. The traditional buyers, foreign states like China, they've got their own domestic financial and economic problems, so they're buying less of US treasuries. And then some of the traditional traders, Goldman Sachs, etc., that might be purchasing those, are moving into other areas. So, and I think if you combine that with the fact that the US government is going to hit their debt ceiling again early to mid 2025, and where by whatever numbers you crunch, it's going to be a divided government. You could have Camilla in the White House, or you could have Trump in the White House, but you're probably going to have a Republican Senate and a Democratic Congress. So it's going to be really difficult to solve the debt ceiling issue in a country like America, where the US dollar, as we've just talked about, has such primacy, and they could hit the debt ceiling and not be able to pay their debts. I think there is a risk. There is a very real risk. This bull market and the influence of the dollar will take a real shock in mid or early 2025, and that's certainly something that we're looking at and speaking with our clients and partners with about how they're preparing and mitigating those potential risks.
Just use the word primacy, and I think we talked about the geopolitical, military, and economic primacy. This will also determine. The positioning of these different empires or countries around the world, China, USA, And just your thoughts on the supply chain, the AI and tech. Kai-Fu Lee, I believe it was, wrote a good book on AI. He seems to think that China, they may be behind at the moment on some respects, but in the long term, they will win out. And whoever gets ahead in AI and all that stuff will do much better. And I see here in Mexico, Sheinbaum, the president, says that she wants to decrease some Chinese imports, but you see China coming in all over the place in Mexico and in other parts of the world. Just your thoughts sort of on this competition. Where are we at with Chinese technology, their AI development, their startups, and versus the West?
So Xi Jinping is generally quite a risk averse leader, and he's learnt the hard way, and his father suffered terribly under earlier governments and the Communist Party, and he's naturally a very risk averse person. And our analysis, and the analysis of many others, is that he probably sits in the camp of being quite cautious about AI, recognizing the huge benefits, but also recognizing if this technology advances unchecked, it could quickly speed up and speed out of our hands and out of our control. And I think that's very valid. And I think most people working in AI do sit in one of two camps, that AI is only a force for good versus those that are like, AI is a force for good, but it is also a force that could quickly get out of control. We know that China, that Russia, that the USA and many other countries, but certainly those three powerhouses have been working on this for a long time and recognizing that there's a huge advantage. There's a huge military advantage in how artificial intelligence is employed. There's a huge intelligence collection advantage. There's obviously huge advantages for businesses that are able to capitalize and utilize that. So there's certainly states that are putting a lot of effort into this, and I think that's something that we'd be silly if we thought that OpenAI and Perplexity are the only good AI tools out there. There is Russian and Chinese equivalents, and those are being developed, and I think those will have a big impact. Will they be able to compete with the US models? I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows today the answer to that question. But I think certainly it's going to continue to be a disruptor, and all that's going to occur on top of the sanctions. We've got massive sanctions leveled against Venezuela, against Iran, against Russia, of course, and several other countries. We've got trade wars that are going to move into the trillions, not just billions, but trillions of dollars, impacting economies around the world. And then we've got these massive geopolitical tensions, that some of which we've unpacked, that are going to definitely disrupt supply chains. We saw that during COVID. That was a pandemic, which was predicted. It wasn't a black swan event. COVID or a global pandemic was certainly predicted, and I know that's something you've spoken a lot about on your podcast. And these things are going to impact supply chains, and people need to be testing and need to be looking at it. Most companies might look at their suppliers, but very few companies are then looking at their second and third order suppliers and what the potential impact on their businesses would be. Even though in COVID we saw very painfully the impact of not knowing who your suppliers were.
Interesting what you mentioned about Xi Jinping and China. I just listened to this interview with Patrick David. I think Max Tegmark was his name, who was talking about AI in China, and that some Chinese AI companies were again innovating, getting a little too crazy, and that China passed a law because they were afraid. They were saying if this continued, basically the CCP, the national government, wouldn't be running the show. It would be one of my greatest fears, algocracy, or it would become a technate or a technocracy, that AI would basically become the government. And China sort of passed a bill to, for now, slow that down. And so kind of confirming what you're saying, that there is this fear of losing power and control. I do want to ask you about, there's the migration issue, but Mexico, because I'm here in Mexico. There's some of my listeners in Mexico. They're interested in Mexico, Latin America. And again, I listened to your podcast and I thought you were totally spot on. I was, again, reading the newspapers the other day. The past few days, you had 5 decapitated heads found here in Jalisco, and Acapulco. 4 taxi drivers were shot dead. 2 Mexican public officials, I think, in Mexico City, shot dead. 1 priest in Chiapas assassinated. Just on and on it goes. And so it's a paradox. I mean, you mentioned that again in your podcast, and I think you were accurate. You can live daily life, nothing happens most of the time, but all around you, there's heads being chopped and the one of the top attorney generals I read it here in Guadalajara. I just read it like a week ago. He was assassinated. Part of the government, and so the government and the organized crime are one and the same in Mexico. This has many implications for economy, for business. 50 semi trailers are hijacked every day in Mexico, and it really bothers me because there's so much potential here, foreign direct investment. They want to come in, but at the same time, like, how can we invest in Mexico if you freaks, you cartels are just destroying the economy and the ability for people to have business? I mean, I know of Mexicans just lower on the lower socioeconomic spectrum. They get hired to run a shop. The next day, you got cartels or crime demanding the monthly mafia tax, the piso. And I'm like, how can we live normally? Just let us. You guys do your drug stuff, but at least let us do business and live normally. But just what are your thoughts on Mexico, Latin America, and so forth?
Now, I'm going to choose my words a little bit carefully because I'll be back in Mexico soon. But I think ultimately, I've lived and worked in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, Haiti, Lebanon, all over the world, in Liberia during the Ebola outbreak. I've never said no to anyone wanting to do anything. Never, except my son. He's the only person I say no to. But everyone else, my answer is always yes. If you've got a business imperative, if you've got a reason you need to do that, then yes, you can do that. And this is how we do it safely. This is how we do it securely. This is how we identify, we assess, we prioritize, and then mitigate the risks. And we just follow that process. So I'll always say yes. And it's the same right now, working with a few clients looking at Mexico, looking at the issues you're talking about. The stats are just crazy about the levels of corruption, trucks being stolen, bribes having to be paid from a variety of different actors. But if companies have an economic reason, a business strategy that they're trying to employ, and there's a reason why they're doing X, they're producing certain products, selling certain products in Mexico, well, that's a reasonable thing. They're doing something that's legal. They're doing something that's benefiting their company, benefiting their shareholders, ultimately benefiting Mexicans who are able to be employed there, who are able to have a better standard of living. But to do so without recognizing the risks is actually to breach generally your responsibility as a director. And whether you're in America, the UK, or Sweden, a failure to identify the risks in your business and appropriately assess them and mitigate them is actually an offense. In Sweden, it's the Swedish Company Act, and there's similar legislations in nearly every company. So board members actually have a legal responsibility to thoroughly understand the risks that you're talking about and to make sure they're appropriately mitigated. And you can do it. You can do it. It's not easy. And as you said, you've given some great examples about Mexico and across Latin America, where homicide rates are huge, kidnapping rates are just phenomenal. I think the official kidnapping numbers for 2023 were nearly 1,000 people, which is shocking. But our estimates are that that's less than 10% of the actual number. I mean, the amount of people getting kidnapped would be in the at least tens of thousands every year. And some of those would be express kidnappings, but it doesn't matter. It's still kidnappings. And if you've got expats and local staff that are driving trucks, that are doing deliveries, that are producing certain products and selling those products, you've got a responsibility as a business leader to identify those risks and make sure that your business can operate securely. But it's complex. It's really complex. I mean, that's one of the reasons, very sadly, why I know I'm not going to be unemployed in the near future, because the risks are huge and mitigating them is complex, but it can be done. And I hope you heard that message on the podcast, that I would not say to anyone, don't go on holidays on Mexico. And I would never say to a business, don't invest in Mexico. I'd say, do it. Go on holidays, enjoy the beaches, invest in the opportunities and the business opportunities that Mexico has. But make sure you understand the risks and make sure you have a really comprehensive plan to understand the risks and make sure that your business operations are safe and your reputation is safe too. Because if you find out in 6 months' time, or even worse, if your shareholders or the media finds out that systematically your company's been paying bribes to cartels, for example, there goes your reputation.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said about the paradox. Again, it's not to say I still can't understand it. Like, I've been here for over a decade, and personally, I've had people around me heard stories. I've seen dead bodies, but on the street, but I haven't been touched. And so it's just kind of like, as you said, if you proper risk assessment, whether individually or for businesses, you need to do that. And so there are plenty, of Mexican successful businesses, international businesses. They're doing well amidst all of this chaos. And so there's just a way to do it. We've been covering a lot. Is there anything else that you think is interesting or important to bring up? Or any?
I think one thing we haven't touched on, which is perhaps a critical one, is misinformation and disinformation and the way that's flowing and how people, your podcast, my podcast is hopefully contributing to the dissemination of facts, not misinformation or disinformation. But I think that's a really important one. The World Economic Forum has their annual register of risks, and that's been the number one. It's been in the top 5 for the last decade, and I think it's only getting more and more significant. And as long as you have politicians, normal mainstream politicians in the UK, in Europe, in America, that are telling outright lies, easy to prove lies, misinformation and disinformation is only going to become much, much harder to understand.
Yeah, I like to leave the onus on the individual, the citizen, to determine what is true and false. As you say, if someone, we can confirm or not confirm. I would prefer that than having someone else have to do the confirming for me, because we're on that line between liberty, freedom, and democracy, and that's one of my fears in the West is totalitarianism, the decline of freedom in the West. Because I have had basically George Orwell 1984, right? Because that's one of my big beefs when it comes to EU and US. Because I've had the Department of Homeland Security ban me for PayPal for no reason, for thought crime, basically because they didn't like the way that I was, or my guests, what they were saying. That is not exactly, the values that every day our leaders espouse. You hear Ursula von der Leyen come out and say, liberty, democracy, Russia bad, authoritarianism. But wait a minute, why are we deplatforming American and European podcasters? So that's only my concern is there's a fine line with that. And what would sort of just your takeaway then, or final thought for us when it comes to themes? You seem to be, I get from you, like resilient. You need to be resilient. You do seem optimistic, forward thinking, and so sort of your final thought or theme or takeaway for us.
I think I'm glad you mentioned 1984, actually, and I recommend if listeners to today's podcast only get one thing, it's to go out and buy a copy of 1984. The book was, the book and some of the others were originally banned when they were first published. I read that again in 2016, just by chance, after Donald Trump had been elected. Oh my gosh, I'm getting goosebumps now just thinking. I remember reading the book going, oh my gosh, this is exactly what's happening in America right now. Not entirely, not everything in the book, but parts of the book. And you can certainly see parallels with many countries, not just America, but a variety of countries around the world. So I encourage anyone, read 1984 and just see what a prophetic book that was in many ways. It's a little bit funny, but also a little bit scary. But I think to your point, yes, I'm definitely optimistic about the future. I know there's going to be punches to the side of the face on a Tuesday afternoon when everything's looking sunny. I know the stock market's going to collapse again at some point. I know there's going to be more civil unrest. I know that there's going to be more international armed conflicts. I know that there's going to be pain in the countries where I live and countries where colleagues and friends are living. I accept that. I don't condone it. I don't undermine it. I recognize it's going to occur. But I think if you can be just a little bit more observant, either as a business leader, as a business, or just as a human being, listen to podcasts, read widely, get into debates, healthy, respectful debates with people you don't agree with, then you'll get through those storms better than other people. Those storms are coming. They really are. Whether you're a conspiracy theorist or not, there are storms coming. We just have to look at the last few years to recognize storms are coming, and storms have come, and we get through them. But how well you get through them is up to you. It's up to you and who you surround yourself with and what information you're digesting. So keep listening. Keep listening to podcasts. Keep reading widely, and you'll get through that. There are going to be risks, but there's definitely hope.
I just couldn't help. I fully agree with what you said. I was just laughing. You mentioned storm and conspiracy theory, and there's the whole QAnon. They use the storm. I forget something. The storm is, there's a phrase. I patently I reject QAnon, which I did from the beginning. I viewed it as some sort of psychological operation, and so no, do not trust the plan. Where are the best places to find you? All of the links are in the description, but your podcast, Too Secure, let us know.
Oh, fantastic! Thanks very much. I mean, people can listen to my rants and guests on the International Risk Podcast. That's a weekly podcast. We release episodes every Monday. You can find me on LinkedIn, Dominic Bowen, and of course, if you look up strategic advisory at Too Secure, you'll find my team doing their amazing work there.
All right. Maybe one of these days we'll have some tequila or tacos when you pass through Mexico again. And thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on. It's a great pleasure to have this chat with you.